This is slide 5 in our 60s unit on the counterculture. This is commonly what we refer to as the hippie movement. Counterculture, the name, really explains what you need to know about them. They go and they live a lifestyle counter to what the culture of America says it should be. Society says you should live this way. They are going to live counter to or against or opposite that. So the counterculture, going against what society says is acceptable. Okay? And we begin that with the anti, whatever, establishment. And this is another way of saying sort of the same thing. They go against the established way of doing things, against the norm. Okay? So if the government or if society says you should do something this way, they're going to purposely do it just the opposite way. Okay? There was a common saying among the anti-establishment, among the counterculture, trust no one over 30. Okay? That anybody over 30 simply does not have your best interest at heart. Okay? Anti-authority protests, anti-establishment protests would spring up on college campuses. The University of California at Berkeley was probably the most well-known of the protest campuses. Cal Berkeley, it was known, University of California at Berkeley. And again, like we said in our last slide, college campuses are the center of the protest movement, simply because college students were exempt from the draft. Okay? Now, two things really sort of define the counterculture movement. Sex and drugs. Okay? And if you want to throw in a sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you can. And we're going to talk about all three of those today, kind of tied in with the counterculture here. And we will start with the drug use, because more than anything else, the counterculture is known for drug use. Marijuana and LSD were the two most common drugs of choice in the 60s. And they are hallucinogens, which means they make you see things that aren't there or see things as they really aren't. And the big name in the drug culture was Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary. Now, this is a picture of Leary up here. Leary was a Harvard University professor. And Leary would conduct experiments with LSD. Now that wasn't all that common, or that uncommon, not that uncommon. What Leary was doing, though, was experimenting with LSD on his students. He would get together with his students, in theory, to conduct experiments, but really it was simply, an excuse to get together and drop some acid. And the counterculture loved it. They said, look, you're telling us drugs are bad, and here's a professor at one of your most prestigious universities saying drugs are good. Do drugs. So the fact that Leary is promoting them really helps kind of give the counterculture some credibility here. Okay? The slogan that is most often associated with Leary and the drug use of the counterculture is turn on, tune in, and drop out. There, up in the corner of your slide, you see there. Turn on, tune in, and drop out. This was the mantra, the motto, the slogan associated with them. And Leary would preach this to young people across the country. Turn on to our lifestyle, the way we do things. Tune in to what we're saying. Tune into our message. Drop out of society. Drop out of, accepted society. What your parents say you should be doing, what the government say you should be doing. Turn on, tune in, and drop out was Leary's sort of mantra here. Right? Now, that's the drug sort of culture. Sexual attitudes in the 60s was basically a sex without consequences. Right? Sex without consequences. And that is due very much in large part to the invention in 1960, right at the beginning of the decade, 1960, of the birth control pill. Suddenly, the possibility of sex without consequences was possible. Okay? Whenever, wherever you were, and that was the mantra, sex whenever, wherever, with whomever. Suddenly you didn't have to worry about Junior showing up 9 months later. The birth control pill allowed for sex without consequences to become not just a reality, but the norm for the counterculture. There was a popular song in the 60s. The chorus said, if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. Right? If you can't be with the one you love, so if the person you love isn't around, well, that's okay. Love whoever you're with. So sex wherever, whenever, with whomever was the norm in the counterculture. Right? And much of the sex was done while high on drugs. So the sex and the drugs tied in together very, very neatly. Okay? Now, if you're thinking sort of hippies, and as you see in the picture here, right there, that image that comes to mind of what a hippie might look like, we need to talk about communes. Okay? Communes are for those people who grow very discontented, very unhappy with the materialism and the greed of suburban society, the suburbs. Right? And they would withdraw to rural areas, out to the woods, to farms, and they would form communities of their own. They would live in community with one another. They would commune. That's where the name comes from, commune, community. These are groups of people who would go off in the middle of the woods and live and never be seen or heard from again. They were happy if, they would leave everybody alone and just wanted to be left alone. Right? These are the people that would, load up the Volkswagen van and head out in the middle of nowhere, get an old bus, pack everything you owned or everybody, and head out to the middle of nowhere and never be seen again. Right? They wanted to be alone and be left alone and leave everybody alone. They just didn't want any contact with anybody. Now, these are people that would live in a community. So everybody shared in the work. Everybody helped cook. Everybody helped clean. Everybody helped build things. Everybody helped educate and raise the children. They shared in everything. They shared in all the work, including they shared in each other. Partner swapping was very common among communes. Again, sex with whomever, whenever, wherever. Okay. Now, one thing you do have to understand about communes here. Typically speaking, not always, but typically speaking, people in communes made a commitment to live drug-free. Because if you're responsible for, everything you have, including children, you can't be running around hopped up on acid all the time. You can't be stoned all the time. So typically communes lived drug-free lives. Okay? Now, last topic here is music. Nothing really is more identifiable with the 60s than the music of the decade that comes out of it. And really there's 4 different types. Okay? We'll continue rock, which comes along in the 1950s, and sort of the big names in rock music of the 60s. You see the picture on the right here. If anybody knows who that is, say it now. Very good. That's the Grateful Dead. Deadheads, as they were known, were spent most of their life stoned. And I'm betting some of them still do. I don't know, but I'm just guessing. But the Grateful Dead would be the real big name in rock music. The Doors, Jefferson Airplane are really big. Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix. Okay? But the Grateful Dead would be the big name in rock music. Okay? We also see, thanks to the war, a lot of protest music and folk music. This is the singer-songwriter. One person would write music and then they would perform their own music. So a lot of singer-songwriter, folk, protest music. Not just war protest, but civil rights protest, anti-poverty songs, and of course a lot of anti-war songs. But the big name in folk and protest music, down here at the bottom, this is very good. Yes, that's a very young Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan would be the big name in protest and folk music. Dylan's still around today. Incredibly well-known artist, poet, writer, won a Nobel Prize for his songwriting. Right. Next, we see the British invasion begin as band after band after band would come streaming across the Atlantic into the United States because there was a lot more money to be made here. The big name in the British invasion is the Beatles. Okay? February 12, 1964, the Beatles arrive in America for the first time. 25,000 people, mostly screaming teenage girls, are at Kennedy Airport in, not Kennedy, LaGuardia, sorry, Kennedy, not there yet, LaGuardia Airport in New York City. 25,000 screaming teenage girls there to welcome the Beatles. They hadn't even been to America before, and already they're that popular. But they would lead the onslaught of British bands coming to the United States. The Beatles would go on to have 20 different number one hits in the 1960s. 20 number one hits in the decade, which was amazing. Okay? I Want to Hold Your Hand would become their first one. Okay? And our last different type of music here, Motown. Motown records are founded to record black musicians, black artists. Black musicians had trouble getting recorded by white record companies. So a man named Berry Gordy, G-O-R-D-Y, Berry Gordy, G-O-R-D-Y. And again, I've spelled it twice for you, so that's a hint. You should know that. Berry Gordy founded Motown Records. It would become the most profitable black-owned business in the world. Okay? And it allows black artists to cross over into white mainstream American music. Right? Because most teenagers didn't care whether it was white or black or whatever, they just liked good music. And because teens had money, they would buy it. If Motown would record it, white teenagers would buy it and listen to it. So Motown allows blacks to cross over into mainstream white America music. The big name in Motown records or in black music here is a female group, Diana Ross and the Supremes. Diana Ross and the Supremes would become Motown's greatest success. They would have 12 number one hits in the 60s. 12. Now, that's not near as many as the Beatles' 20, but consider, this is a black female group. So they got 2 strikes against them already, trying to make it in a white male-dominated industry. So maybe their 12 is even more impressive than the Beatles' 20. I don't know. But Diana Ross and Supremes, Stop in the Name of Love would be their first big number one hit. Okay? And if you're going to talk music of the 60s, you can't do it without talking about Woodstock. Woodstock would define the counterculture movement. It would define the decade in terms of music, in terms of protests and counterculture, the anti-establishment, you name it. Woodstock was a music festival. It was planned 3 days. Here you see the poster there for it. 3 days of peace and music, an Aquarian exposition in White Lake, New York. It took place on a dairy farm. A guy named Max Yasgur, you don't have to know his name, but it's a cool name. Max Yasgur donated his land to hold this music festival in Woodstock, New York. Okay? was a hillside, and I'll show you some videos of this, but a couple of really good videos on Woodstock. It was a hillside, sort of a natural amphitheater down at the base of the hill. They set up a stage, and they actually sold 186,000 tickets. 186,000 tickets they sold to this music festival. Anybody and everybody who's in music was booked to play at Woodstock. Eventually, they gave up trying to collect tickets. The fence surrounding the farm was ceremonially torn down, and people just started streaming into the farm. There was an estimated 500,000 people. That's 500,000 people at Woodstock over the 3 days. And basically any sort of sex or drugs or alcohol could be had. The protesters of the music festival, not the protesters, but general mainstream America, wanted to play up the fact that look at how all these people here, all this violence erupted, all these people died, and it just didn't happen that way. Everything I've read, there's no violence at Woodstock. Nobody gets killed in a fight, nobody gets shot, nobody gets stabbed, nothing like that. There wasn't any violence, and it could just be that everybody was so stoned out of their mind and hopped up on pot and LSD that they didn't care about fighting. You know, everybody's just, hey, this is great. You know, enjoy it. Anyway, there were 3 deaths at Woodstock, none of them from violence. One was a heroin overdose. The second one, somebody had a ruptured appendix. Their appendix burst, and they died before they could get them to medical treatment, to a hospital. And the third guy, one guy got run over by a tractor. I guess he was stoned, wandering around, passed out in this field, and a guy ran over a farmer, ran over him with his tractor. So there were 3 deaths at Woodstock. There were 2 births at Woodstock. 2 babies were born at Woodstock, which I think would be the coolest claim to fame ever, to be able to say that you were born at Woodstock. God knows how many babies were conceived at Woodstock. But 32 musical acts appeared on stage over the 3 days. And this concert, this festival, would define the decade. They've tried to recreate it every now and then, and it just doesn't work because it wasn't just about the names, the music. It was about what was going on in the country at the time. It was about the protests surrounding the war. It was about the counterculture movement, young people going out on their own, finding their own way. It's about peace and love and not war and violence. So you can't recreate that. It was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, the 3 days of peace and music at Woodstock.